Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding today's hearing. I look forward to a robust conversation. I think it really is important that we're making investments in our nation's infrastructure that can meaningfully improve people's lives. Strong infrastructure can provide individuals a safe road to drive on. It can help lower gas prices. It can make it affordable for people to heat their homes on a cold winter day. I think we're going to hear a lot about the infrastructure bill that was passed. And so let me share one of my biggest challenges that I see with the $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill. It wasn't paid for as promised. And so what does that mean? The $1.2 trillion bill is funded with $256 billion in debt. Right now, our national debt sits at $30 trillion. And so for a family of four, that breaks down to $360,000 for a family of four. That's their share of the national debt. Another issue with the bill is its implementation is being dictated often by bureaucrats in Washington, D.C., and not by local officials. And Mr. Chairman, I think this will actually fit into a lot of our conversation. Who's best to make these decisions? Is it local officials, and we have some local officials here with us today, or is it bureaucrats sitting in Washington, D.C.? For example, Biden's Department of Transportation wants to fund projects that often are following an ideological agenda. Highway investments that don't meet certain Democratic guidelines and vague standards may not be prioritized for new grant money under the new Federal Highway Administration guidelines, some of which were recently released. This leaves potential projects vulnerable to political motivation, underfunding if they don't meet the social demands of the Department of Transportation. Under these same conditions, it also means plans to expand existing roads and bridges that reduce traffic congestion can get sidelines. We need to make sure the money gets to the local governments that need it. We don't need more bureaucrats in Washington picking winners and losers. Another challenge with the bill is the wasteful spending unrelated to infrastructure. For example, the bill invests $7.5 billion in electric vehicle charging stations across the country. And I suspect we'll have a robust conversation today about the definition of infrastructure. And you may believe that electric vehicles are the future. You may disagree with that. But to me, that's not the issue here. What's at issue is whether the federal government or the private sector should determine where electric charging stations should be. As gas stations were being built across the United States in the 1900s, were those being built by the federal government or the private sector? If a private individual builds a gas station and it's successful, good for her. And if it loses money, it's unfortunate. But either way, taxpayers aren't on the hook. This bill, in many ways, is replacing the role of the private sector with the federal government. Over the past year, we saw the current administration continually discourage private sector investment in infrastructure. For example, on day one of the Biden administration, he canceled the Keystone Pipeline, killing thousands of jobs in the private sector with a stroke of a pen. A year later, costs have risen 30%. That's often $173 per household. And in cold states like Wisconsin, prices are up 45%. Home heating costs uniquely hurt low-income workers and people living on fixed incomes. I think that's really important. High heating costs to heat your homes is uniquely impacting low-income workers and seniors living on fixed incomes. Without enough domestic energy production, we're often importing energy from overseas. And so, for example, in November of last year, November of 2021, we paid almost $1.5 billion for Russian gas to fuel our economy. But Mr. Chairman, here's where I think we can be productive, because I always try to do this in my opening statement, not just where I disagree, but where we can be productive. I think one of the keys here is how do we figure out a way to make cost-effective investments in our infrastructure? So, for example, New York City recently built a subway tunnel of 3.5 miles at a cost of $12 billion. It's $3.5 billion per mile, which when you start to look at the national averages, and the New York Times had a great article on this, it was 7 times the cost of the global average. There's a similar story in Massachusetts. In 2005, the plan to connect Boston to its suburbs with a light rail ballooned from $500 million to a $3 billion blunder. We spend more money per mile on rail transit than almost any country in the world. I think it's a massive opportunity that we can look for improvement. I think we should reevaluate the environmental review process and labor regulations to complete infrastructure projects far more efficiently. And we can do this without lowering our environmental standards. Reducing costs and regulatory burdens will improve infrastructure projects now and into the future. And I'll say it again, America needs infrastructure that keeps the cost of gas low, provides safe roads, and heats our homes. Instead, we're often seeing the results of overspending and inflation. I think infrastructure can meaningfully improve Americans' daily lives, and I hope we find ways to do that in our discussion today. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.